So thank you everyone for the awesome number and depth of responses that we got. This would not be a very interesting presentation without those. And we also hope that you found the reflection yesterday and continuing reflection helpful. And since we got so much data, this can really only scratch the surface of kind of what you all are observing and thinking. And so the kind of one of the first data points that came up was that the responses were very evenly split between the 3 prompts. And so while you all are pointing out, you know, types of inequities and exclusions, there were just as many ideas for individual and collective actions as well. And so on that first prompt, an inequity or exclusion I've observed. And so the most common response there was naming inequities in growing. And among those, half focused on inequities in land access and ownership. And a few, some of those kind of spoke very generally about that point, and others mentioned some specifics. And so one of those was the land requirement size for growers, the minimum, that was referring to the minimum of 40 acres, as well as just general tensions between scaling or large scale production and equitable outcomes. There was also mention of kind of land ownership and tenure relations and how that affects the ability to invest in a perennial crop, for example, if you're renting. And then there was also some kind of pointing out of the focus on traditional landowners as opposed to public, communal, and community-owned lands. And then the other half of the responses about inequities in growing focused on the ability for growers to take on high risk. Oh. Inequities in equipment access and capital, and the relative privilege of early adopters in terms of resources and ties with institutions. Thank you. Having trouble with the, there we go, okay. And so these were the other, so while 40% of the responses around inequity referred to growing Kernza, these were the other 60% of responses. And these are categories of responses rather than, for the most part, rather than individual responses. So multiple people mentioned these, and they're a bit abstracted from the responses. And so entry into the Kernza work and culture was, and these are also in descending order, so that was a commonly mentioned response. Kind of entry as a site of exclusion. There was a lot of mention about the community generally being very white, and also its collaborators. There were responses about the capacity, expertise, and experiential knowledge to do work on race, equity, diversity, and justice. And I'll kind of let you just take a glance at some of the rest of those. I won't read through all of them, but really appreciated all these observations that came in. And so the next prompt was about the concrete action that we can all do in our own work. And so this figure shows the context in which those example actions are occurring within. And so 58%, the most common was taking actions within the research or nonprofit institutions that many of you all work in. And then 30% were about the relationships of those institutions with communities, growers, businesses, and organizations. And then fewer responses on doing these actions within supply chains. And again, these are some of the categories of actions that the responses were speaking to, again, in descending order. And there was really the most variation here, which makes sense because everybody's working aspects of Kernza. And again, I won't read through all of these, but you can take a glance. And again, kind of the most common was within the space of hiring practices, recruitment, onboarding, and work environment. And then just to make a note down at the bottom, a few responses also referred to practices to discontinue rather than actions to take. And so I think that's a notable aspect of these responses to pay attention to as well. And this brings us to the third prompt, the concrete actions the Kernza network can pursue collectively. And so these were the kind of categories that I grouped these responses into. And so that first line speaks to internal practices, kind of internal facing practices, practices that we can take on or that can be changed within the network. And so some examples of those were more knowledge on inequities and planning and goals, intentional practices, hiring practices, hearing more voices internally, codifying requirements around this, and figuring out new ways to kind of internally have kind of feedback processes around these questions. And then the other three categories were more externally facing types of actions for the network. And so I did add in this, these were just a few responses, but there were some points, some ideas around how to better recruit and support students, particularly students of color. And those responses referred to undergrads, grad, intern. And then this next point, redistribute material resources and de-risk, which was more oriented toward the supply chains. Those categories of responses were much about providing land, seed, capital, and funding in new ways, providing employment opportunities, expanding cooperatives, and de-risking entrance into Kernza, particularly for supply chain actors, as well as transition support. So that was also a category of responses. And then this last one is about co-production and co-creation processes. And so that one speaks to co-creation systematically excluded groups across all, reframing how work on Kernza is done to really support priorities of those groups, and doing this early on and for the long term. And this also spoke to not only within kind of research institution spaces, but also co-producing supply chains and grower guides and aspects of the work that are outward facing, as I categorize this one. And so these were a few kind of within these responses that dealt with concrete actions the network can pursue collectively. I pulled out a few kind of possible tensions within these. And so the first of those is there really is a systemic understanding of how land access excludes or can exclude growers. And that was the most common of the to be identified. And so the question is then kind of what to do about that. And only 3 of the kind of action responses spoke to that point. And so that seems to be an area for continued brainstorming. Another interesting kind of tension that came through in these collective actions was about the types of partners to engage. So various responses mentioned engaging with partners who already want to work with Kernza, or groups that require listening to their priorities and seeing if Kernza is a fit for them. And then a third type of response was supporting and collaborating with non-Kernza related activities and initiatives for equity and justice. And then this last bullet, which I also thought was interesting and worth pointing out, was in terms of relationship building, that some responses mentioned inviting and supporting historically marginalized farmers and businesses to join Kernza meetings. And then others mentioned Kernza actors attending and promoting attendance within this community to meetings hosted by BIPOC leaders, growers, and innovators. And this is my last slide and just a bit of conclusion on the very rapid analysis that this was. And so, as I said, a lot of the inequities observed were about production and about land, whereas a lot of the individual actions to take were set in changing practices and relationships at research and NGO institutions. There was more on equitable distribution of resources than at the collective action level. There wasn't a lot of detail on the supply chain nodes beyond producers, whether about inequities or actions, but the makers panel is coming up, and so that's a place to continue ruminating on that. Yeah, and then I'll kind of like leave these other 2 points up here just, you know, just for y'all to think about. I think that that last one, calling out the Kernza community as white dominated, was again a really common inequity to mention, but there were also some kind of action responses that noted the need to better understand. So in what ways is and isn't the network white dominated? What are the cultural patterns? Who is really involved? And what is the power distribution? So digging deeper into this sense of this as a white dominated space was another kind of interesting place to continue this conversation. And so on that note, we're just going to hang on to this data and look for ways to keep working with it. And, you know, we're open to ideas about kind of what to do with this going forward. And there are also ongoing initiatives on equity within the network. And so to bring this data into conversation with those. So that's all I have. And thank you for bearing with me on this very like rapid turnaround analysis. And we will still have the raffle. We didn't forget about that. And we're going to do that after the makers panel. And we hope y'all remembered your numbers from yesterday. And if not, we'll figure it out. So thank you.
Great, thank you again, Amy, for that incredible turnaround. I'm in awe of all of that information from 24 hours. We're gonna take a break now, and I just wanna encourage folks that you still have time to write on the timeline if you feel inclined. This doesn't need to be any big event from the Kernza development. It can be, I planted Kernza, or this is the first time I heard about Kernza. And again, the empty ones you can also write, future aspirations. So great, we'll see you again after the break.